Few turning points in human history are as monumental as the French Revolution. It didn't just erase the last traces of the feudal order in Western Europe, it proved that absolute universal monarchy was unsustainable. Crucially for our channel, it was as influential in establishing the modern economic system as the teachings of Adam Smith himself. Like a massive fault line, the French Revolution triggered a series of aftershocks that would shake the world for the next 150 years. Today, we examine the economics, the chaos, and the irony of the decade that changed everything. This series of upheavals began with the 1789 French Revolution, peaked with the July Revolution of 1830 and the Europe-shaking Revolution of 1848. Although it was thought that the age of revolutions closed with 1848, the wave would return in the 20th century with the 1911 Chinese Revolution and the 1917 October Revolution. Just as Adam Smith, known as the father of capitalism, and the Industrial Revolution created a new capitalist class, the French Revolution would instantly turn millions of people living in starvation into citizens. These seemingly unrelated, even contradictory currents would reduce the economic and political influence of the nobility in Western Europe and form the foundation of today's political and economic order. When the calendar showed 1789, France was the most populous country in Europe with a population of 26 million. Although France was the most powerful state in Europe in the 18th century, it bore the heavy burden of interminable great wars throughout that century. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1702 to 1713, and the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, were immense struggles of the entire continent, divided into two blocks led by either France or England. The final account of these two wars would be settled by the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which some historians called the First World War. The British Empire would emerge victorious from the 7 Years' War as an undisputed superpower. Despite the defeat of the French coalition, the War of the Spanish Succession and the War of the Austrian Succession did not lead to significant territorial losses for France. However, the 7 Years' War led to the loss of colonies and trade privileges in present-day North America, the Caribbean Sea, and India, which were critical losses that the French economy could not replace. France fought alongside Spain and the Americans against the British Empire in the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, and the French Navy played a vital role in winning that war. However, keeping a large navy ready and fighting in the Atlantic drove the final nail in the coffin of the French economy. So much so that in 1779, while the British Empire had 90 large ships of the line, the collapsed French economy was struggling to keep 63 large warships at sea. The British had advantages such as profitable international trade that could finance this navy, newly acquired colonies, and a public debt managed with low interest rates. The collapse of the French economy was not solely due to the 3 lost major wars and the American Revolutionary War. New gold mines discovered in Brazil in 1730 brought a new flow of precious metals into the global economy for decades, increasing the money supply based on precious metals and raising all prices in the international system. While the population in Europe almost doubled in the last century with wealth coming from the colonies, agricultural output fell with bad harvests in the 1780s. Almost the entire population in France, except for the nobles and clergy, was suffering from hunger and poverty. There was such relentless hunger that families began to mourn when a new child was born. Half of the babies died from hunger and disease before reaching the age of 2. The French tax system was regressive, that is, it increased relatively more relative to income from the highest income class downwards. The nobility and the church were almost exempt from tax. While the French king had unlimited authority with regards to expenditures, income generation was left to 13 local administrations known as parlements. Although the word parlement in French passed into English as parliament, French parlement units were local administrations headed by nobles, where judges and tax officials formed the bureaucracy, and they collected the state's revenue. As you can guess, those burdened with the tax were the peasants and the bourgeois classes. In an article published in 1989 by the famous economist David Weir, he explains that while the French national debt reached 55.6% of the gross national product, GNP, before the revolution, due to the risk of bankruptcy of the French state, it paid almost as much interest as England, whose public debt reached 181.8% of its national income. British public debt had low interest rates because it was financed with resource-rich colonies and an unrivaled British merchant fleet in global trade. Even this one example from exactly 250 years ago strikingly proves that high public debt is not dangerous when financed with the right interest rate and when high public debt flows into the right jobs and projects. But the opposite is also true. France's skewed tax system is the biggest reason for the revolution. The peasants didn't have enough food to survive after giving taxes in kind from the harvest they produced to the seigneurs, that is, the nobles they were tied to. Just as additional taxes on the 13 colonies of England triggered the American Revolutionary War, hungry and angry peasants and bourgeois grinding their teeth at the nobles would light the fire of the French Revolution. Swiss banker Jacques Necker, who tried to reform the French financial system, would be fired months after establishing a real state accounting system in 1781 and making a perfect state budget. Necker's suggestion definitely not to get involved in the American Revolutionary War would also be ignored. When Necker was recalled to duty in 1788, it was too late for everything. The revolution would begin days after he was dismissed on July 11, 1789, and ordered to leave the country immediately. His successor, Joseph Fouillon de Douai, would be hanged from a lamppost by the revolutionaries 2 weeks later. The development that lit the final gunpowder of the revolution was the king's gathering of the Estates General, which had not met since 1614 to solve the economic situation. The Parlement, managed by the nobles, rebelled against the king, opposing the imposition of new taxes on the church and nobles. The only way for the king to pass a new tax law was to reassemble the Estates General, a general assembly. The Estates General consisted of 3 parts: the church, 303 delegates, the nobility, 282 delegates, and the commoners, the bourgeois class, 578 delegates. The base upon which this forced assembly rested was quite strange. While the clergy consisted of approximately 100,000 people and the nobility class of 400,000 people, commoners made up 98% of the population. The representatives of the commoners were lawyers, merchants, landowners, and bureaucrats. These people were molded by the ideas put forward by the works of intellectuals such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and J.J. Rousseau. The majority of church representatives were local priests, and they were aware of the misery the people were in. Within months, with the support of some priests and nobles, this strange assembly would transform into an assembly fully dominated by commoners, that is, the Assemblée Nationale, the National Assembly. This new assembly would be the heart of the revolution. Moreover, the new assembly had taken public support in Paris and some of the French military elements under its control. The most important name in this development was the young General Gilbert du Motier de Lafayette, a hero of the American Revolutionary War and an important figure in the Assemblée Nationale. It's thought that the French Revolution began on July 14, 1789, with the public storming the Bastille prison, but this is not true. The revolution essentially began on June 17, 1789, with the declaration of the Assemblée Nationale, the National Assembly. There were already only 7 prisoners in the Bastille. The revolutionaries attacked the Bastille to seize the weapons and ammunition inside. With the public rebelling in Paris with some soldiers and attacking the Bastille, the National Assembly de facto became both the legislative and executive organ of France. The initial aim of the assembly was not to establish a republic regime, but a constitutional monarchy. However, the new assembly was not strong enough to control the angry crowds of people who had risen up. While bureaucrats and ministers of the hated Ancien regime were lynched in the cities, peasants also targeted nobles and tax collectors. Castles and manors were being burned and looted. The genie was out of the bottle now. Those targeted in the cities were hanged from lampposts by crowds amid screams of "à la lanterne" to the lamppost. Execution with the guillotine, known as the national razor, or Madame Guillotine, was not yet common. Meanwhile, nobles fleeing the country started collecting mercenaries with the wealth they could smuggle out. Military units starting to gather on France's northeastern borders were a threat to the new regime. While the assembly took control of all armed elements and the army against new threats, it created armed militias in rural areas. Meanwhile, the Fundamental Declaration of Citizenship and Human Rights, La Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, was published. This declaration would be the conceptual basis of the French Constitution in 1791. The king would have to reluctantly approve the Constitution. However, the revolution was no longer under the control of the assembly or the army. The balance and division of tasks between the king and the National Assembly would not last long. The assembly and the country were divided into various political factions. Because these factions sat collectively on the right and left of the parliament, they also created the definitions of the modern political world. The monarchists aimed to reverse a significant part of the change brought about by the revolution. They sat on the right side of the assembly. The Girondins formed the right and liberal wing of the revolution. They supported the spread of the revolution to other countries, leading to the declaration of war on Austria and Prussia in 1792. They had the biggest share in the dethronement and execution of the king. They sat on the left side of the assembly. The Montagnards formed the left and extreme wing of the Jacobin Club. This group was adept at playing to the tune of the crowds armed to the teeth in Paris. They sat in the upper left rows of the parliament. The Feuillants adopted the central right view, thinking that the revolution should end with the establishment of the Constitution. The Egalitarians were early socialists, and a large group known as centrists, who were populists without a clear color, sat between the Jacobin Club and the monarchists. The currents we know today as right and left political concepts derived from this seating arrangement in the Assemblée Nationale. The father of the revolution was the Jacobin Club, formed together by the Girondins and Montagnards. It was a typical bourgeois club entered by paying dues. Later, when the Girondins in this club were purged, this bourgeois custom would also disappear. Gradually, this current took on a more radical identity. The main power of these clubs now rested on the people of Paris, a population of 600,000, half of whom were unemployed and increasingly becoming a dangerous identity. These were called sans-culottes. 3 years after the revolution, the Jacobin Club, dominant in the assembly, was trying to cope with increasing inflation, monarchist rebellions, and armies collected by nobles. The public, especially the bourgeoisie in Paris, was reacting to the enormous inflation. The cause of inflation was simple. The assembly had printed 100 million livres in 1789 and 200 million livres in 1790. The revolution had changed the tax order, but could not solve supply problems. The confiscation of the properties of the church, which owned 10% of all land in 1790, disturbed staunch Catholic regions like Normandy, Vendée, and Brittany. The rebellion that broke out in Vendée, 1793 to 1796, would lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. By 1791, many remnants of the old regime had been removed, but new institutions could not be put in their place. In 1792, the escape of the king and queen from Paris to Varennes and their forced return to Paris and the war started with Austria and Prussia would strengthen the radical Jacobin Club. On September 22, 1792, the Republic was proclaimed. Ultimately, the Jacobin majority would ensure the trial of the king and queen for treason and their execution in 1793. With the execution of the king, England, Spain, Naples, and Holland also joined the war against France. The city of Toulon was blockaded by the British Navy. A young French colonel would show tremendous success in Toulon with his intelligence and cool-headedness. This colonel, promoted to brigadier general, was given command of the Italian army. This young officer's name was Napoleon Bonaparte. The wars started by external powers to crush the revolution revealed the feeling of patriotism and armies composed of volunteers fighting for the homeland. This was another political approach revealed by the French Revolution: nationalism. In 1793, the Montagnards purged the Girondins by accusing them of treason in a masterful coup in the National Assembly. The famous Montagnard leader, lawyer Maximilien Robespierre, would seize power this time by purging his rivals within the Montagnard faction. In Paris's famous Place de la Concorde, the guillotine had become relentlessly operative. The process called the Reign of Terror had begun. Tens of thousands of people would lose their heads on the national razor. While Robespierre purged his opponents to establish his ideal republic, he was not fully in control of the assembly and the streets. Moreover, the fear that anyone accused by Robespierre could be tried and executed within a few days united the National Assembly and the streets against him. The sans-culottes who brought him to power would turn against Robespierre this time. Robespierre was arrested in a counter-coup, tried the next day with his supporters, and sent to the guillotine on the same day, July 28, 1794. The era of terror had ended. The successes of the revolutionary armies in Italy and Holland could not fix the collapsed economy inside. Hunger would trigger a new Paris uprising in 1795, and the Jacobins would be declared scapegoats for this trend, and a new wave of arrests and executions would sweep France. In 1795, a new constitution that would soften the French Revolution was accepted. This period between 1795 and 1799 is called the Directory period, named after the five-person executive council implemented to prevent the emergence of a new Robespierre. While monarchists were about to draw non-political, centrist members to their ranks, the Directory administration sensed the approaching danger. It decided to purge its rivals with an internal coup. Troops under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte, returning from Italy upon the administration's order, began arresting monarchists in Paris. Napoleon ordered his soldiers to load their cannons with grape shot in the narrow streets of Paris. When fired at close range, the cannons loaded with grape shot mowed down the rebels like machine guns. Along with monarchists, extreme Jacobins were also targets of this internal coup. This time, the guillotine did not work much. Members arrested in the assembly were exiled to French Guiana, a penal colony. Napoleon Bonaparte had now become a strongman militarily and politically. His ambitions were incredible. Now it was his turn to stage a coup. After months of planning, the assembly was raided and dissolved, and the directors were persuaded to resign. All power was gathered in 3 consuls, fitting for the classical Roman period. However, the consuls were not equal. Napoleon Bonaparte, as the first consul, would first become a dictator, have a new constitution prepared, and 5 years later, on December 2, 1804, he would become the first French emperor. Moreover, while Napoleon was crowned emperor, he had Pope Pius VII brought to Paris.
In this unforgettable ceremony, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands. The custom was for the king or emperor to kneel before the Pope and wait for the Pope to place the crown, and brazenly placed it on his own head. Then his wife, Josephine, knelt before him, and he personally crowned the empress. The crown he wore was not the French king's crown. That crown had been destroyed in the Revolution. Napoleon's crown was made inspired by the early medieval crown of the famous Emperor Charlemagne. The end of the decade that changed the world was this magnificent theater. The revolution began with ideals of liberty and ended with an emperor crowning himself. As Charles Dickens depicted in A Tale of Two Cities, the revolution was born from horrific poverty. Yet, as Victor Hugo showed later in Les Miserables, after all the wars and political upheavals, the crushing poverty of the common people remained. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars did not eliminate hunger. What happened to the millions who died in the process.